It begins, as so many human breakthroughs do, with something ordinary. In the winter of 1782, in the provincial town of Annonay in southern France, Joseph Michel Montgolfier was sitting by a fire. He was restless by nature, the kind of man who could not watch a fire without wondering what it meant. As he warmed himself, he noticed scraps of paper in the hearth rising with the smoke. They swirled upwards, tugged by invisible currents. Most people might watch for a moment, then turn back to their supper. But Joseph Michel lingered. He later described the moment in a letter. I saw little bits of scorched paper rising rapidly into the air, and I was struck with the idea of constructing a machine which would rise in like manner. Joseph Michel was 41 years old at the time. He came from a long line of paper makers. His family ran one of the most respected paper mills in France, producing fine sheets for books, ledgers, and government offices. He was not an academic scientist. He had little formal training, but he was endlessly curious. The kind of amateur inventor who filled notebooks with schemes, hydraulic machines, military fortifications, ways to improve the papermaking trade. Most of these ideas went nowhere. Yet this one, the sight of paper rising on a column of heated air, was different. His younger brother, Jacques Etienne, was cut from another cloth. Etienne was practical, cautious, better at execution. Where Joseph Michel dreamed, Etienne measured. He ran the business side of the family mill, made connections in Paris, and had the patience to translate ideas into working models. Together, they made an unlikely team. One with imagination bordering on recklessness, the other with the discipline to keep it grounded. In their mill, surrounded by stacks of parchment and cloth scraps, the brothers began to build. They stitched together envelopes from layers of taffeta and paper, coated with alum to resist burning. These early balloons were not much to look at, bulging sacks of patched-together fabric tied with rope. Beneath each they hung a small brazier, into which they would throw bundles of straw, wool, or chopped wood. When the fire caught, the envelope swelled. Slowly, impossibly, it lifted off the ground. The first attempts were crude. Some balloons shot up and collapsed within minutes. Others drifted a few hundred meters, then crashed in a field, frightening cows and tearing on rocks. But each success was intoxicating. A local official, skeptical at first, recalled in a memorandum that flying paper bags startled villagers and sent children chasing across the meadows. Farmers muttered about witchcraft. Priests warned that it was folly to play with air and fire. And yet the sight of a man-made object floating into the heavens was irresistible. The Montgolfiers were convinced that the fire created a new substance, a kind of lighter-than-air smoke. They called it gaz Montgolfier, Montgolfier gas. The name stuck in pamphlets and news reports. We now know, of course, it was simply hot air, warmed molecules expanding, becoming less dense than the cooler atmosphere, and therefore rising. But in the chemistry of the day, an era still dominated by the now discarded theory of phlogiston, the brothers' explanation seemed plausible. What mattered more than theory was demonstration, and demonstrate they did. In December 1782, they launched a balloon nearly 3 feet in diameter that stayed aloft for more than a minute. In January, they built a larger one, nearly 10 feet wide, that rose to an estimated 200 meters before descending. With each experiment, they refined their methods: stronger fabric, better fireproofing, different fuels. They recorded times, distances, and materials. Soon, Annonay was buzzing with talk of the balloon men. France at the time was a country primed for spectacle. The Enlightenment had turned curiosity into a cultural currency. Paris was alive with salons where natural philosophers debated electricity, magnetism, and the chemistry of gases. Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment had recently captured imaginations across Europe. Jacques Etienne himself, while on business in Paris, had attended lectures on the work of Joseph Priestley and Henry Cavendish, who were isolating new gases. Air was no longer a void. It was a substance to be studied, a frontier to be measured. In this atmosphere, the Montgolfiers' experiments were more than provincial amusements. They were part of a larger hunger to know the world and to bend it. They wrote letters to the Académie des Sciences, describing their contraptions. In one, Joseph Michel claimed that his invention could raise men into the heavens, carry them across rivers and mountains, even bring military advantage by floating over the walls of a city. It was half science, half fantasy. Yet the Academy listened. Neighbors told stories of balloons rising like new suns above Annonay, glowing from the firelight. Some claimed to see them miles away, drifting against the wind. The town, known until then mostly for paper, now found itself on the map for something stranger: flight. But behind the wonder was also fear. Rumors spread of balloons setting barns ablaze, or of spirits carrying them aloft. In a deeply Catholic region, toying with the sky could feel blasphemous. The brothers, practical men of business, tried to reassure their neighbors. They invited officials to witness their launches, to record times and distances, to give the enterprise an air of legitimacy. The more they flew, the more serious it became. By the spring of 1783, they were preparing something grander, a balloon 30 feet tall, with a capacity of nearly 700 cubic meters. It required weeks of work to assemble, with dozens of hands sewing panels of cloth together in the Montgolfier workshop. They tested the seams with boiling water, reinforced the fabric with rope, painted symbols on the sides. The whole town buzzed with anticipation. This time, they would not launch in secret fields. They would do it publicly in Annonay's town square, before witnesses of authority, mayors, magistrates, guild leaders. It would be a demonstration not just of curiosity, but of mastery. And so, on June 4th, 1783, the square filled with townspeople craning their necks to see. The brothers stoked the fire beneath the massive envelope. Flames roared, smoke billowed, and the balloon strained at its ropes. Slowly the cords were cut. The machine rose, higher and higher, until it cleared the rooftops, then the hills beyond. For 10 minutes it drifted, covering more than a mile, before sinking back to earth in a distant meadow. The crowd was stunned into silence, then erupted in cheers. Officials signed affidavits attesting to the flight. News spread rapidly to Paris. Within weeks, the king himself would hear of the papermakers who had lifted the sky. It had begun with smoke, with scraps of paper in a hearth. But now, the question of human flight had shifted from impossible dream to tantalizing possibility. Paris hears everything eventually. Word of the Annonay flight, paper and silk, fire and audacity, traveled along postal roads and in the pockets of officials who carried gossip as eagerly as decrees. The tale ripened in salons. 2 papermakers out in the provinces had made a globe breathe, then cut the ropes and let it go. Some listeners smiled indulgently. Others leaned forward and asked for details. What size? How long? How high? The answers were imprecise, but the effect was precise enough. The court wanted a spectacle. The brothers were summoned toward Paris, and with Paris came scale. Jacques Etienne, ever the organizer, understood that their rustic workshop would not do for a capital that measured itself in splendor. He cultivated an alliance with Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, a celebrated manufacturer of luxury wallpaper. Where the brothers brought flame and fabric, Réveillon supplied craft, varnish, and a sense for show. In his Faubourg Saint-Antoine works, artisans stitched panels of taffeta and paper into an envelope that was both technical apparatus and theater piece. Flourishes crept in alongside seams, medallions, gilded motifs, a crown of fleur-de-lis. Signals that this was not merely an experiment, but a performance fit for a monarch's gaze. The court's curiosity hardened into logistics. If living passengers were even to be contemplated, there must first be a trial. The royal household, cautious and fascinated in equal measure, suggested a compromise that sounded like a fable. Before men flew, let a sheep, a duck, and a rooster go up. The choices were not whimsical. The duck, already a creature of air and water, would be the control. The rooster, a barnyard pedestrian, would test the effect on a non-flying bird. The sheep, a stand-in for human physiology, would tell them whether lungs and hearts could stand the ascent. This was Enlightenment reasoning, expressed in barnyard terms. Taxonomy pressed into service of courage. On the morning of September 19th, 1783, the gardens of Versailles became an open-air laboratory. Courtiers arranged themselves as if for a masque. On one side, the delicacy of hedges clipped to an inch. On the other, a bulging globe stitched by men with calloused hands. The brazier below it was a metal throat waiting to be fed. Jacques Etienne oversaw the fueling with the vigilance of a man who had come to understand, the hard way, that fire and fabric had terms of their own. Servants piled straw, chopped wool, and a measure of chopped wood into the pan. Heat nosed upward. The skin warmed. The seams trembled. The huge thing came alive. For the court, the awe was edged with apprehension. They had applauded automata and electrical tricks in salons, but this contraption did not merely simulate the natural world. It proposed to join it. When the basket, really a wicker cage, was fastened beneath the envelope and the animals placed inside, a murmur passed through the crowd. The duck blinked as if irritation were its only philosophy. The rooster huffed and settled. The sheep bleated a complaint that reads, in every era, as common sense. Then the ropes were loosed. The balloon rose with the mute authority of heat. It lifted past the clipped hedges, the stretched necks, the embroidered waistcoats, and the hat plumes bristling in 1,000 small gusts of status. In that minute, all the rhetoric of Versailles, rank, ritual, precedence, was reduced to something simpler. Faces turned upward, hands raised to shade eyes, silence broken only by the rustle of skirts and the whisper of flame. The thing climbed. It was not graceful, exactly. It pulsed and rocked in little breaths, as if surprised by itself. But it climbed. 8 minutes passed like a held breath. The balloon crossed the gardens and descended beyond the formal boundaries of courtly geometry, touching down in a field outside the royal enclosure. Observers scrambled after it. Accounts from the day note singed patches where stray sparks had kissed the envelope, and a landing that jolted the basket but caused no harm to its reluctant passengers. The sheep, by most tellings, seemed more aggrieved than injured. The duck, smug as data, survived beautifully. The rooster was ruffled, but indignant, which is to say, normal. Back at Versailles, the point had been made in a language the court understood. The test was complete, the omens favorable, the glory within reach. If animals could rise and return, then the barrier was not metaphysical. It was procedural. It was a matter of fabric, fuel, and nerve. In the days that followed, Paris devoured the story. Coffee houses rehearsed the details, improving them in the retelling. Printmakers hurried to their plates, balloons with wreaths and cherubs, balloons bestriding miniature Parises, balloons that could only be called balloons because no one yet had a better word. Children flew paper bags over kitchen fires and singed their fingers. Ladies wore coiffures à la Montgolfier, hair piled high in the shape of the new obsession. The city negotiated with the sky the way it negotiates with every novelty, by absorbing it into fashion first, and philosophy later. Behind the spectacle, the practical questions multiplied. How large must the envelope be to bear a man? How to prevent the fabric from scorching when the flame licked too close? What fuel produced the hottest air without belching embers into the silk? Logs made smoke, but flung sparks. Straw lit quickly, but collapsed into ash. Wool smoldered with steady heat. The brothers experimented with mixtures, the way cooks hunt for a perfect flame under a precarious souffle. They adjusted the distance between the brazier and the mouth of the balloon, tinkered with vents to regulate lift, wrestled, sometimes literally, with ropes that swelled, slipped, and threatened to overrule intention. Paperwork grew as surely as the envelopes did. Permissions had to be obtained. Venues secured. Tethers inspected. Officials reassured that the city would not be set alight by falling cinders. The Academy wanted descriptions, measurements, and, when possible, instruments aboard. There was talk of a barometer. If a man went up, let him bring numbers down. Enlightenment spectacle is spectacle, yes, but always with a notebook in the pocket. At Réveillon's works, the next balloon took on its ceremonial armor. Artisans painted signs of the zodiac and royal emblems, as if to bind heaven and crown into the fabric itself. The brothers did not object. They understood theater. Jacques Etienne, especially, grasped that favor was a material like silk or alum. If you wanted to float in Paris, you had to float in the king's good graces. Not everyone cheered. Preachers warned from pulpits about the sin of presumption. about babble retold in paper and fire. Carters muttered that frightened horses bolted at the sight of these drifting globes. A farmer outside the city swore a balloon had descended upon his field like a demon, and then, finding only beats, slunk away. The city, for its part, considered the problem of traffic. What happens when wonder interrupts commerce? What happens when a floating thing demands a street's attention? Paris thrives on novelty, but even novelty must wait its turn at the corner. In this atmosphere, charged with approval, anxiety, and the brisk crackle of opportunity, the brothers made a decision that carried the story over a threshold. If there was to be a first ascent by human beings, it would need a man willing to be swallowed by the mouth of a heated globe and trust that hot air, managed with care and luck, would refuse the earth. Volunteers appeared, some bold, some foolish, most both. Among them, a young man with an appetite for risk and a head for science stepped forward and refused to step back. He had already ridden a balloon on a tether and felt the rope's ceaseless commentary on the wind. He knew the nearness of flame to silk, the way the envelope trembled when the fire found a seam. He also knew what the city wanted. It wanted a story that ended with feet on the ground and eyes full of sky. The court, consulted again, weighed symbolism against safety, glory against blame. In the end, the calculation shifted not because certainty had grown, but because doubt had exhausted itself. Animals had gone up and returned. A city had learned to look heavenward without flinching. The apparatus, gaudy, clumsy, altogether improbable, had done its work and done it again. When the decision came, it did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived as a set of practical instructions. Where, when, how much fuel, who would attend, how far to keep the crowd back, what to do if the silk caught. On schedules like this, history hangs. Versailles had looked up and found itself reflected in a globe of paper and heat. Paris would soon do the same. And then, with ropes cut and fire managed like a temper, human beings would step into a basket, lift their heads, and commit the oldest of longings to an act. From that day in the royal gardens, the sky ceased to be a ceiling and became a plan. By the autumn of 1783, the balloons had captured more than Paris. They had captured the human imagination itself. Broadsheets printed engravings of globes rising above rooftops. Ladies' wigs were sculpted à la Montgolfier, and children played at lighting scraps of paper to watch them lift toward the ceiling. But beneath the delight was a deeper question. If animals could survive, why not us? That question demanded a volunteer, and Paris found one in Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier. De Rosier was a science teacher with the temperament of a performer. He ran a small museum of curiosities in Paris, where he gave public lectures on chemistry, physics, and the natural sciences. He was known for theatrical experiments, igniting hydrogen-filled balloons in crowded lecture halls, or demonstrating the properties of vacuum pumps by suffocating small animals under glass domes. His audiences gasped, recoiled, and returned for more. This was Enlightenment pedagogy as entertainment, and de Rosier was addicted to both the knowledge and the attention it won him. When the Montgolfier brothers prepared their balloon for human flight, de Rosier insisted he should be among the first passengers. He argued that he understood the dangers better than any courtier or soldier. He knew how to tend the fire, how to monitor the silk for scorch marks, how to interpret the machine's subtle movements. More than anything, he wanted the glory. The king, Louis XVI, was horrified at the idea. He proposed a grim compromise. The first human ascent should be attempted by condemned criminals. If they perished, it would be no loss to the realm. But de Rosier, affronted, protested that such an ignoble trial would ruin the very meaning of the experiment. Enlightenment demanded courage, not cowardice. Eventually, with support from influential courtiers, the king relented. It would be de Rosier and a companion, a marquis named François Laurent d'Arlande. On the morning of November 21st, 1783, crowds gathered at the gardens of the Château de la Muette on the western edge of Paris. Soldiers held back the press of bodies. Scientists jostled for position with fishmongers and clerks. Above them loomed the Montgolfier's creation, a massive balloon of blue and gold silk, decorated with suns and royal emblems, its skirt reinforced with leather to resist the licking flames. At its base, a circular gallery, an open platform, encircled the brazier. It was not so much a basket as a balcony hung beneath a globe. De Rosière and Darland climbed aboard, dressed not in protective gear, but in wigs and frock coats. They carried bundles of straw and wool to feed the fire mid-flight. Around them, the brazier roared. Embers spat upward. The silk rustled with heat. Etienne Montgolfier called out final instructions, and attendants cut the ropes. The balloon rose. Gasps echoed through the crowd as the contraption cleared the treetops. Witnesses reported that people fell to their knees, some in prayer, others in disbelief. The city of Paris stretched beneath the men, shrinking into a miniature of itself. Courtyards like squares on a chessboard, the Seine a ribbon of dull silver, church spires like pins. Inside the gallery, de Rosière and Darlands scrambled to keep the fire alive. They tossed fuel into the brazier, then stamped out sparks that leapt dangerously close to the silk above their heads. At one point, the fabric began to scorch, and Darlandes shouted in panic. De Rosière doused the hot patch with a sponge soaked in wine, improvising a cooling method that would become standard practice. For 25 minutes, they drifted. Contemporary estimates put their altitude at nearly 3,000 feet. From that height, they described a stillness unlike anything they had known, the clamor of the city replaced by the faint hiss of the wind and the occasional crackle of their fire. Birds flew below them. Smoke from chimneys lay flat across rooftops like drawn lines. The world seemed inverted, the solid earth distant and insubstantial, the air itself a floor they could walk upon. They traveled almost 6 miles before beginning their descent. As the fire waned, the balloon sagged gently downward. They landed safely in the fields beyond the city walls, cheered by peasants who rushed to greet them. Some reports suggest the locals were suspicious, fearing the fiery globe was a demon or a weapon. But when they recognized the weary men climbing out of the gallery, they joined the celebration. De Rosière and Darlandes returned to Paris as heroes. The Académie des Sciences recorded the event with solemnity. They have had the honor of being the first to rise into the atmosphere by means of an artificial machine, and to have traversed the air in a free flight. For the first time in history, human beings had cut the tether to the ground and trusted themselves to the buoyancy of heated air. The feat was not merely a curiosity. It was a line crossed, a psychological boundary shattered. Mankind had always looked at the sky with longing, imagining Icarus, sketching wings, dreaming of angels. Now, at last, 2 men had stood in the open air, not falling, not plummeting, but sustained. Still, the accomplishment was fragile. The balloon was scorched in several places, and without constant vigilance, it might have gone up in flames. The brothers knew that each success contained the seed of catastrophe. But on that November day, the risks were forgotten. Paris had witnessed a new category of experience, one that could no longer be returned to myth. De Rosière wrote later that the sight of the city from above was like seeing the earth spread out like a map. Maps, until then, had been abstractions, the view of a god or a cartographer's imagination. For the first time, a man had seen the world from above with his own eyes. The age of flight had begun, and it carried both wonder and peril in equal measure. The Montgolfier brothers had captured Paris with fire and paper. But even as their balloon floated over the rooftops, another figure was preparing to steal the heavens with a different element entirely: hydrogen. Jacques Charles was no provincial papermaker. He was a physicist in Paris, a professor of experimental science, a man of precision and formulas. Where the Montgolfiers improvised with straw, wool, and smoke, Charles worked with laboratories, instruments, and the authority of the Académie des Sciences. He believed hot air was too crude, too dangerous, too imprecise. There was a gas, recently discovered, invisible, weightless compared to ordinary air, that could do the job better. Henry Cavendish had called it inflammable air. Antoine Lavoisier would soon christen it hydrogen. To Jacques Charles, it was the future. Charles partnered with two brothers of his own, Anne-Jean and Nicolas Louis Robert, skilled instrument makers who could turn his calculations into silk and rope. Together, they constructed a balloon with a silk envelope coated in rubber for tightness, designed to trap the elusive hydrogen inside. It took days of work to generate the gas, dripping sulfuric acid onto iron filings in vast vats, collecting the bubbles, channeling them into the balloon. Parisians crowded outside the construction site, watching clouds of steam hiss from the vats and wondering whether such invisible stuff could truly carry a man. On August the 27th, 1783, just 2 months after the Montgolfier's Annonay triumph, Charles and the Robert brothers launched the world's first hydrogen balloon from the Champ de Mars, the military parade ground in Paris. It was unmanned, a test. The golden globe, shimmering in sunlight, rose quickly and silently. It drifted north, covering nearly 15 miles before landing in the countryside. There, farmers who had never seen such a contraption attacked it with pitchforks. They slashed the silk, tore at the ropes, and trampled the remains. They feared, reasonably enough, that the strange globe was a monster, or perhaps some weapon sent by sorcery. Authorities later issued proclamations warning rural villagers not to destroy descending balloons. But the damage was done. The first hydrogen balloon had ended in pieces, a victim of confusion and fear. Charles was undeterred. The Montgolfiers might have the flair, but he would have the science. He planned a manned ascent with hydrogen. By December, the preparations were complete. The balloon was larger, 30 feet tall, its silk gleaming with varnish. Hydrogen seeped into its envelope over the course of 4 laborious days. Parisians flocked to see it swell, filling the Champ de Mars like a golden sun tethered to the ground. On December 1st, 1783, Jacques Charles himself and Nicolas Louis Robert climbed aboard. Thousands of spectators gathered, including Benjamin Franklin, who was in Paris as America's ambassador. Franklin, who had flown kites in storms to summon electricity from the clouds, now stood watching as men prepared to ride the sky itself. Asked later what practical use balloons might serve, Franklin gave his famous reply, "Of what use is a newborn child?" The ropes were cut. The balloon leapt skyward with startling speed, rising silently. No roaring fire, no smoke. Charles and Robert carried instruments, a barometer, a thermometer, notebooks to record observations. As they ascended, they measured pressure dropping, temperature sinking. They noted the stillness of the air, the blue of the sky deepening above. It was not just a spectacle, it was data. They traveled more than 25 miles in just over 2 hours, landing safely near Nelles-la-Vallée. Robert disembarked, content. But Charles, seized by exhilaration, climbed back aboard and cut the ropes once more. Alone, he soared to nearly 10,000 feet, higher than any human had yet gone. At that altitude, the cold gnawed at his fingers, and the air thinned to the point of pain. His ears rang, his face burned with chill. But he exulted. Later he wrote of the sublime terror of being suspended in such vast silence. The world spread below like a painted map, the horizon curved. When he descended, he wept with joy. He declared he would never again risk such solitude in the sky, yet he knew he had glimpsed something extraordinary, what it meant for man not merely to rise, but to measure, to record, to understand. Hydrogen balloons soon multiplied. They were lighter, more controllable, and far less dependent on constant fueling than hot air. But they carried their own danger. They were explosive. A stray spark could reduce the entire apparatus to flame. Still, the appeal was undeniable. For science, hydrogen offered the promise of sustained, high-altitude flights. For spectacle, it offered the grandeur of golden globes floating silently over cities. The rivalry between hot air and hydrogen became a kind of philosophical divide. The Montgolfier's balloons were dramatic, theatrical, a triumph of daring improvisation. They belonged to the world of artisans, paper, and fire. Charles's hydrogen balloons were scientific, precise, the property of academies and laboratories. Both were children of the Enlightenment, but they spoke different dialects. One in the language of wonder, the other in the language of measurement. Paris adored both. Fashion houses sold trinkets modeled on Montgolfier balloons. Salons discussed Charles's barometric readings as if they were poetry. Balloon mania gripped Europe. Within months, men in Britain, Italy, and Germany were launching their own designs. Some flights carried passengers. Others carried instruments. All carried the same subtext. Mankind had cracked a barrier older than civilization itself. It is difficult, from the perspective of centuries, to recapture the shock of those months. In less than a year, humanity had gone from never leaving the ground to producing rival technologies of flight. From June to December 1783, the sky itself had been colonized, not with armies, but with dreamers and tinkerers. When the Montgolfiers looked at smoke, they saw possibility. When Charles looked at hydrogen, he saw order. Between them, they offered two visions of what flight could mean: the spectacle that thrills and the science that explains. And as Paris tilted its head back, watching balloons climb into the atmosphere, it was not clear which vision would prevail. For a few dazzling months, the sky above Europe seemed filled with balloons. The news of Annonay, Versailles, La Muette, and the Champ de Mars had spread like sparks on straw. Suddenly, every city wanted its own ascent. Balloons appeared in paintings, on porcelain, embroidered into waistcoats. Ladies in Paris wore gowns patterned with tiny silk globes. Coiffures rose in balloon shapes, complete with trailing ribbons for ropes. Children begged for miniature models. Toymakers obliged. Balloon mania had taken hold. It was easy to forget that the technology was fragile, experimental, and dangerous. Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier, the science teacher turned national celebrity, could not stop. The man who had first ridden the Montgolfier balloon grew restless. Tethered flights no longer satisfied him. The 25-minute voyage over Paris had only whetted his appetite. He wanted more altitude, more distance, more daring, and above all, he wanted to be the first to cross the English Channel. The Channel had always been a stage for rivalry. To cross it by balloon would prove that this was not merely a spectacle, but a new mode of transport, a revolution linking nations. De Rosier designed a hybrid craft, a Montgolfier hot air balloon slung beneath a hydrogen balloon. Fire for lift, gas for endurance. He believed it would offer the best of both worlds. It was also a recipe for catastrophe. On June 15, 1785, de Rosier and his companion Pierre Romain launched from the French coast. The sky was clear, the winds favorable. But scarcely half an hour into their flight, disaster struck. Witnesses on the ground saw the balloon tremble, then ignite. Flames licked the hydrogen envelope. A deafening explosion followed. The wreckage plummeted, and both men were killed instantly. De Rosier's death was the first recorded aviation fatality. The man who had once looked down upon Paris now lay broken on the fields of Wimereux. His tragedy sent ripples across Europe. Balloons, once toys of delight, now carried the weight of mortality. But risk only sharpened fascination. Each accident was reported with grim detail in the press, and readers devoured the accounts. When a balloon crashed, people rushed to the site to claim souvenirs. Scraps of scorched silk, lengths of rope, even splinters of wicker. Danger was not a deterrent. It was part of the allure. And there were many dangers. Fires were constant threats. A single spark could turn silk into tinder. Balloons often rose triumphantly, only to descend in flames, the fire that gave them life becoming their undoing. Even when fire spared them, winds did not. Balloons were at the mercy of currents they could not steer. Pilots drifted off course, crashed into forests, landed in rivers. Some were attacked by frightened villagers who thought they were monsters descending from the clouds. Yet for every disaster, there was also wonder. Scientists seized balloons as platforms for knowledge. In 1804, Joseph Gay-Lussac ascended to nearly 23,000 feet, carrying a barometer and vials to collect air. He measured its composition at different altitudes, proving that the atmosphere was a consistent mix of oxygen and nitrogen. 100 years later, in 1912, Victor Hess would ride a balloon high above Vienna and discover cosmic rays streaming from space. a finding that would earn him the Nobel Prize. Each ascent added to the map of the invisible. For the public, the wonder was enough. Balloon launches became spectacles. Cities built arenas where thousands could watch ascents. Vendors sold refreshments. Musicians played. A successful flight was part scientific demonstration, part carnival. Parisian crowds, once enthralled by fireworks, now craned their necks for balloons. The aesthetic of ballooning reshaped art. Engravings depicted globes floating above famous landmarks, exaggerated into symbols of human ambition. Poets wrote verses comparing them to suns, moons, and divine chariots. Philosophers debated their meaning. Were they steps toward progress, or dangerous indulgences of vanity? Edmund Burke, the British statesman, mocked balloon fever as philosophy turned into a show. Others argued it was the ultimate Enlightenment achievement. Knowledge, risk, and spectacle united in one fragile globe. But peril always lurked beneath the silk. Balloons carried no controls. A rope here, a valve there, but ultimately, the pilot was a passenger of the wind. Some dreamed of steering, adding wings, rudders, propellers, but most attempts failed. The sky was free, but it was not ours to command. The Montgolfier brothers themselves stepped back from the frenzy. They had proven their invention, secured their fame, and earned honors from the crown. Etienne was made a member of the Legion of Honor. Joseph Michel was given a pension, but they were craftsmen, not showmen. They returned to their paper mills and left the balloon craze to others. It was left to men like de Rosier, reckless, passionate, doomed to push the limits. His death cast a shadow over ballooning, but it also gave it a martyr. In a way, it confirmed that this was not just a parlor trick. It was serious enough to kill. The 1780s closed with balloons both beloved and mistrusted. They had become symbols of both promise and folly. They reminded people of how quickly human ingenuity could rise, and how suddenly it could fall. Still, the sight of a balloon drifting across the sky never failed to silence a crowd. Children tugged their mothers' sleeves. Laborers stopped mid-swing of hammer or spade. Heads tilted upward in unison. For a moment, all of society shared the same horizon. Wonder and peril were never far apart. That is the truth of every frontier. The balloons of 1783 were fragile things. Silk, paper, rope, and fire. They rose uncertainly, swaying in the wind, more like trembling lanterns than reliable machines. And yet, from them flowed a legacy that outlasted every flame-scorched envelope, every burst of hydrogen. The first legacy was scientific. Balloons opened the sky to measurement. They carried barometers, thermometers, and notebooks higher than mountains. In 1804, Joseph Gay-Lussac's ascent to over 23,000 feet proved that the composition of the atmosphere remained consistent. He returned not just with data, but with a vision. The sky was not a mystery, but a field to be studied. A century later, Victor Hess's balloon flights revealed cosmic rays showering the Earth from outer space, discoveries that redefined physics. Each instrument carried aloft traced its lineage back to the Montgolfier and to Jacques Charles, to men who dared to treat the sky not as myth, but as laboratory. The second legacy was cultural. Balloons changed how we saw ourselves. For the first time, human beings looked down upon their cities and fields, not from mountains, but from above. Paris, seen by Pilatre de Rosier and the Marquis d'Arlande, was not a sprawl of alleys and markets, but a miniature, a map come alive. That shift in perspective mattered. Cartographers began to think differently. Artists painted aerial views that no human eyes had ever known before. Strategists imagined what it would mean to see an enemy from the air. To rise above was to reconceive the ground. The third legacy was emotional. Balloons captured the imagination in a way no calculation could. Children in Annonay, watching scraps of paper rise, grew up to watch globes float into the distance. In Paris, families crowded streets to glimpse ascents, their faces tilted skyward. In Britain, Italy, and Germany, spectators gasped as balloons appeared above rooftops. For the first time in history, the sight of a human-made object in the sky became commonplace. And with it, the idea that the sky was not the sole domain of birds, angels, or gods. Balloons also reshaped the fabric of daily life. They became motifs in fashion, decorations on porcelain, subjects of satire. Some mocked balloon fever as vanity, but the joke could not erase the awe. When Franklin compared a balloon to a newborn child, he meant it as a defense against cynics. A child may not yet be useful, but it contains infinite potential. So too with the balloon, a fragile beginning, a promise of futures not yet imagined. Of course, balloons did not become the dominant technology of flight. They were too vulnerable to wind, too slow to control, too easily undone by spark or storm. In time, they gave way to airships, to airplanes, to rockets. But their weakness was not their failure. It was their gift. By showing what could be done, even imperfectly, they made the impossible suddenly thinkable. Every flight that followed carried traces of those first paper globes. The Wright brothers, bicycle makers from Dayton, Ohio, could look back at the Montgolfiers and recognize themselves. Ordinary craftsmen, transforming scraps of material into wings. Astronauts floating above Earth in capsules could understand what Jacques Charles felt when he wrote of the sublime terror of silence at altitude. Every ascent, whether by jet or rocket, contains within it the first ascent. Men and women daring to leave the ground, not knowing if they would return. And the legacy is not only technical, it is psychological. Before 1783, the sky was a ceiling. After 1783, it was a frontier. That shift changed how humans thought about limits. If we could rise, we could cross oceans. If we could cross oceans, perhaps one day we could leave the planet itself. The leap from Montgolfier smoke to Apollo rockets is vast, but it is also direct. The chain of imagination is unbroken. There is something fitting that the first balloons were made of paper. Paper is humanity's medium of record, the material on which we sketch dreams. Out of sheets of paper came books, laws, scriptures, letters, and then, in the hands of two French brothers, a vehicle to carry us skyward. The same fiber that bore words to posterity bore men into the sky. Today, balloons still rise. Some are toys at festivals, drifting above crowds. Others are instruments, lifting telescopes and sensors into the upper atmosphere. In 2020, scientists launched a balloon from Antarctica that circled the Earth, measuring cosmic radiation much as Hess had done a century before. The principle remains unchanged. Warm air or light gas, sealed fabric, and courage. But the most enduring legacy is perhaps not the science or the spectacle, but the memory of that first collective gasp. The crowd in Annonay, the courtiers at Versailles, the Parisians at La Muette, each moment when thousands of faces tilted skyward in unison, realizing they were watching history rise before them. For once, the divisions of rank and class dissolved. Peasants and princes alike looked up. The sky belonged to everyone, and now, astonishingly, so did the possibility of flight. The Montgolfiers returned to papermaking. Jacques Charles returned to teaching physics. Pilatre de Rosier became the first to die for flight, and in that death proved how real the dream had become. None of them could have guessed that within 2 centuries, human beings would fly faster than sound, cross continents in hours, and leave Earth entirely. But they did not need to guess. They had done enough. They had given us the first ascent. They had shown us that to rise was possible. And so, to those brothers in Annonay with their scraps of cloth and paper, to the court that laughed and then applauded, to the reckless teacher who insisted on stepping into the fire, to the physicist who trusted invisible hydrogen, to the sheep, the duck, and the rooster who paved the way. This is your story. From the Balloonists.